Magnus moved with predatory grace through the stone corridors of Thornfield Keep, his boots silent against floors worn smooth by generations of his ancestors. The sentinel's howl still echoed in his mind, 3 sharp notes that meant immediate danger at the gates. In 15 years of self-imposed exile, nothing had breached the mountain passes without his knowledge. The blackthorn scent shouldn't exist this deep in Shadowmere territory. He descended the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time, past tapestries depicting the pack's ancient victories. Each thread told stories of blood and honor, of alphas who had died protecting their own. Magnus had added his own chapter to that legacy the night he'd killed Elena, and every morning since he'd awakened hoping the moon goddess might finally grant him the same fate. The great hall stretched before him like a cathedral of shadows. Massive timber beams crossed overhead, darkened by centuries of hearth smoke and highland storms. His pack members had already begun gathering, 37 wolves who'd sworn their lives to his protection, who deserved better than a king haunted by ghosts. They parted as he passed, offering the respectful distance that isolation demanded. "Report," Magnus commanded as he reached the main doors. His voice carried the authority of absolute power, though lately it felt more like an anchor dragging him deeper into darkness. Garrett, his most trusted sentinel, stepped forward. The younger wolf's face was pale beneath his auburn beard, and Magnus caught the tremor of uncertainty in his scent. "Alpha King, there are visitors at the outer gates, a woman and children. They're in poor condition." Blackthorns? The name tasted like poison on Magnus's tongue. The rival pack had been enemies since before his grandfather's time, their territory bordering Shadowmere lands to the east. Blood feuds didn't simply disappear because winter made travel difficult. The woman carries their scent, but faintly. As if, Garrett hesitated, his loyalty warring with confusion. "As if it's old, Your Majesty. Faded." Magnus's jaw tightened. Nothing about this made sense. Blackthorn wolves didn't flee to enemy territory with children in tow. They didn't arrive half dead at the gates of their greatest rival expecting mercy. How many children? 7. Alpha King, the youngest, appears no more than 5 summers. Garrett's voice dropped. "They're starving, sir, and the woman is bleeding badly." 7 children. The number struck something deep in Magnus's chest, a resonance he couldn't explain. He forced the feeling down, buried it beneath layers of responsibility and hard-earned caution. Could be a trap. The Blackthorns are cunning enough to use children as weapons. But even as he spoke the words, Magnus knew they rang false. He'd spent decades learning to read deception, and Garrett's confusion was genuine. Whatever waited beyond those gates defied easy explanation. "Shall I turn them away, Alpha King?" Garrett asked, though his tone suggested the idea sat poorly with him. The pack's honor code demanded they protect the innocent, but their survival depended on avoiding Blackthorn entanglements. Magnus closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. Every choice carried consequences. Every decision echoed through lives beyond his own. He'd learned that lesson in blood 15 years ago, when a moment's loss of control had destroyed everything he'd loved. "No," he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Bring them inside. Post guards but offer sanctuary. Whatever their purpose, children don't deserve to freeze in Highland snow." Relief flickered across Garrett's features. At once, Alpha King. As his sentinel departed, Magnus remained in the great hall's shadows, studying the massive hearth, where flames danced like memories. Something about this felt familiar, though he couldn't grasp why. Perhaps it was the mountain's mood, the way the mist clung to the peaks like secrets refusing to be spoken. Or perhaps it was the strange pull he'd felt since dawn, as if the moon goddess herself was orchestrating events beyond his understanding. The pack members began dispersing, returning to their daily duties with the practiced efficiency of wolves who'd learned to trust their alpha's judgment. They didn't question his decision to shelter potential enemies, though Magnus caught whispers of curiosity in their wake. He'd earned their loyalty through years of protection and sacrifice, but lately he wondered if that loyalty was misplaced. Outside, The wind howled across stone battlements, like voices from another world. December storms in the Scottish Highlands could last for weeks, trapping travelers and locals alike in whatever shelter they could find. If the women and children had traveled far, they were fortunate to have reached safety before the worst of winter's fury arrived. Magnus moved toward the entrance hall, his steps measured and deliberate. Whatever truth these strangers carried, whatever chaos their presence might unleash, he would face it as he'd faced every challenge since that terrible night. Alone, responsible, and haunted by choices that could never be unmade. The iron-bound doors stood before him like a gateway between worlds, and beyond them, 7 children whose arrival felt like destiny wrapped in danger. Magnus paused before the iron-bound doors, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. The weight of routine pressed against his shoulders like a familiar burden. For 15 years, these same doors had marked the boundary between his carefully controlled world and the chaos that waited beyond. He'd opened them for traders bringing winter supplies, for pack messengers delivering news from distant territories, for the occasional lost traveler seeking shelter from highland storms. But never for 7 children who might shatter everything he'd built from the ruins of his past. The entrance hall stretched behind him, its stone walls lined with weapons his ancestors had carried into battle. Each sword and shield represented order, tradition, the unbroken chain of leadership that had kept Shadowmere Pack alive for 3 centuries. Magnus had inherited more than a throne. He'd inherited the sacred duty to preserve what others had died protecting. Every sunrise brought that same crushing awareness of what hung in the balance. His daily routine never varied. Dawn brought him to the battlements for territorial assessments, his wolf senses cataloging every scent carried on mountain winds. Morning meant strategy meetings with his inner circle, reviewing patrol reports and resource inventories. Afternoons were dedicated to pack business, settling disputes, training younger wolves, maintaining the delicate balance that kept 37 lives safe in an unforgiving wilderness. Evenings found him alone in his study, poring over ancient texts and territorial maps, searching for threats before they could materialize. It was a life measured in careful distances. Magnus commanded absolute respect, but he'd never allowed himself the luxury of true companionship. His pack members served with unwavering loyalty, yet he kept them at arm's length, protecting them from the darkness that followed him like a shadow. Garrett was the closest thing he had to a friend, but even their conversations remained strictly professional. The younger wolf had tried in the early years to bridge the gap between duty and genuine connection. Magnus had shut down those attempts with the ruthless efficiency of a man who'd learned that caring too deeply led to destruction. The isolation served its purpose. Without emotional entanglements, he could make the hard choices that leadership demanded. When food ran low during bitter winters, he could ration supplies without favoritism. When territorial disputes flared with neighboring packs, he could negotiate from a position of cold calculation rather than personal attachment. When pack members died, and they did die, despite his best efforts, he could grieve privately and continue functioning for the sake of those who remained. But lately, the isolation had begun to chafe, like chains grown too tight. Magnus caught himself lingering during pack gatherings, drawn to the sound of laughter from younger wolves who still remembered joy. He found his steps slowing when he passed the communal areas where his people shared stories and songs inherited from generations past. Sometimes in unguarded moments, he wondered what it might feel like to lower his guard completely, to trust someone with the weight he carried. The longing crept up on him at unexpected moments. When Garrett's mate had given birth to their first cub, Magnus had felt an ache so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. When elderly pack members spoke of children and grandchildren scattered across distant territories, something hollow opened in his chest like a wound that refused to heal. He told himself these feelings were weakness, dangerous indulgences that compromised his ability to lead, but they persisted, growing stronger with each passing season. Winter was the worst time for such thoughts. The mountain passes became impassable, trapping the pack in forced intimacy for months at a time. Magnus watched his people draw closer together against the cold, sharing warmth and comfort that he could observe but never truly join. His quarters remained separate, elevated, untouchable. a fortress within a fortress where he could maintain the illusion of control. Now, with his hand on the door that separated him from 7 unknown children, Magnus felt the foundations of that control shifting like snow before an avalanche. Something about their arrival had awakened hungers he'd thought safely buried. The way Garrett had described them, starving, vulnerable, desperate, struck resonances in places Magnus had locked away years ago. Part of him yearned to fling open the doors and gather them into the warmth and safety his pack could provide. Another part warned that such impulses led to the kind of chaos that destroyed everything he'd sworn to protect. The pack's prosperity hung in delicate balance. Their territory provided enough resources to support their current numbers, but adding 7 mouths would strain supplies already stretched thin by early winter storms. More dangerous still was the political implications of sheltering potential Blackthorn offspring. The rival pack had been quiet lately, but old enmities ran deeper than highland roots. One wrong move could ignite conflicts that would spill blood across both territories. Magnus straightened, squaring his shoulders against the weight of impossible choices. Behind the door lay either redemption or ruin, and 15 years of hard-won wisdom couldn't tell him which. All he knew with certainty was that the moment he opened that door, his carefully ordered world would never be the same again. Magnus drew a steadying breath and pulled the heavy door open. Cold mountain air swept into the entrance hall, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow and something else, something that made his wolf stir uneasily beneath his skin. The sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. 7 children huddled in the stone archway like broken birds seeking shelter from a storm. Their clothes hung in tatters, threadbare wool and rough-spun linen that offered little protection against December's bite. Ice crystals clung to their hair and eyelashes, and their lips had taken on the blue-white pallor that preceded frostbite. But it was their eyes that struck him most, ancient eyes in young faces carrying weights no child should bear. At their feet lay a woman, her auburn hair spread across snow-dusted stones like spilled wine. Blood seeped from beneath her traveling cloak, dark stains that told of wounds too severe for Highland medicine to heal. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale forming clouds that dissipated like departing spirits. Yet even dying, she kept one protective arm curved around the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have seen more than 5 winters. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "The children, they're yours." The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under sudden weight. "Impossible. I would know my own offspring." But even as he spoke, his wolf was cataloging details his conscious mind tried to reject. The eldest boy had Magnus's own dark hair and the proud bearing of Thornfield bloodline. A girl of perhaps 10 summers possessed his steel-gray eyes, though hers held warmth his had forgotten. The smallest ones carried subtler resemblances, the stubborn set of a jaw here, the particular way of holding one's head there, traits that whispered of shared heritage. Moira Blackthorn, the dying woman managed, her gaze fixed on Magnus with desperate intensity. 7 years ago, the autumn gathering, you came to me during the moon madness. Memory flickered at the edges of Magnus's consciousness. Fragments of sensation rather than clear recollection. The taste of wild honey, soft laughter in darkness, hands that welcomed rather than feared. But the images slipped away like morning mist, leaving only an ache where understanding should be. "The magic," Moira continued, her voice growing weaker with each word. "They made you forget, made us both forget. But the children—" A violent cough racked her frame, speckling the snow with crimson. "The children remember everything." Magnus found himself stepping forward despite every instinct screaming caution. The eldest boy, perhaps 12 summers, met his gaze without flinching. In those storm-gray eyes, Magnus saw recognition that went deeper than mere resemblance. The boy knew him, had been waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who understood the weight of secrets. "Father," the boy said simply, and the word shattered the last of Magnus's resistance. He knelt beside Moira, his hands hovering helplessly over wounds that spoke of desperate flight through hostile territory. Who did this? Who sent children into winter storms? Aldrich Blackthorn, she gasped. He discovered the truth, tried to use them as weapons. We fled. Her eyes began to lose focus, but she gripped Magnus's wrist with surprising strength. Protect them. They're innocent of the sins that made them. The woman's final breath left her body like a prayer released to mountain winds. Magnus remained frozen beside her still form, his world tilting on its axis as implications crashed over him in waves. 7 children, his children. Born from a love affair erased by magic he didn't understand, hidden in enemy territory until desperation drove them into the storm. We know about the mate you lost, the eldest boy said quietly. Mother told us. She said the pain made you forget other things too. Magnus looked up sharply. Elena's death was pack knowledge, but the details remained locked in his private hell. How could a Blackthorn child speak of it with such understanding? Behind him, he sensed his pack members gathering. Their confusion rolled off them in waves, loyalty warring with disbelief, duty wrestling with suspicion. Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Alpha King, what are your orders? Magnus rose slowly, his gaze sweeping over 7 faces that carried pieces of his own features. They watched him with a mixture of hope and terror, children who'd lost everything gambling their lives on blood ties they couldn't prove. The political ramifications of accepting them would be catastrophic. War with the Blackthorns seemed inevitable now. His pack's carefully maintained neutrality would shatter like glass. But looking at the smallest girl, Elena, they'd named her, Moira's lips had shaped the word as she died. Magnus felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for 15 years suddenly burned with fierce protective fire. The call to adventure stood before him, wearing the faces of children who shouldn't exist, demanding choices that would reshape everything he'd built from the ashes of his past. Magnus stood motionless in the stone archway, the weight of 7 expectant gazes pressing against him like physical force. The mountain wind whipped through the entrance, but he barely felt the cold. His entire world had narrowed to this impossible moment. These children who claimed his blood, waiting for a decision that would either damn or redeem them all. They could be lying. The thoughts surfaced with desperate hope. Children were easily coached, faces could share coincidental similarities, and desperate people told whatever stories might guarantee survival. But even as his rational mind grasped for doubt, his wolf knew better. The scent markers didn't lie. Beneath the fear and exhaustion, beneath the lingering traces of Blackthorn territory, ran the unmistakable thread of his own bloodline. His hands trembled at his sides. In 15 years of absolute control, Magnus had never allowed himself such visible weakness. Yet here he stood, the Alpha King of Shadowmere, reduced to a terrified man confronting the impossible consequences of forgotten choices. Elena. The smallest girl's name echoed in his mind like accusation and absolution combined. They had named her for his lost mate, a kindness that cut deeper than any blade. What manner of woman would honor the memory that had destroyed him? What cruel god would bring him children bearing the face of his greatest failure? Alpha King? Garrett's voice carried careful neutrality, but Magnus caught the undercurrent of concern. His sentinel had served faithfully for 8 years, had never once questioned a direct command. Now uncertainty radiated from the younger wolf like heat from a forge. The pack was watching, waiting, trusting him to navigate this crisis with the wisdom they'd come to expect. But I have no wisdom for this. Magnus had spent decades preparing for every conceivable threat. Rival pack incursions, resource shortages, political upheavals that could destabilize their territory. He'd never imagined standing face to face with 7 living reminders of magic he didn't understand, of love he couldn't remember, of responsibilities he'd never chosen. The eldest boy, his son, the very concept felt foreign on his tongue, continued watching with those storm-gray eyes that mirrored his own. There was patience in that gaze, terrible understanding that went far beyond his apparent years. This child had carried impossible knowledge across hostile territory, had shepherded 6 younger siblings through winter storms to reach a father who might reject them all. What kind of man would I be to turn them away? Yet the question's inverse haunted him just as deeply. What kind of man risked everything his people had built for children who might destroy them all? The political ramifications stretched before him like an approaching avalanche. Aldrich Blackthorn was no mere territorial rival. He commanded one of the most powerful packs in the Highlands, with alliances reaching south to the lowlands and east toward the coast. If these children truly belonged to him, if Moira Blackthorn had been family or favored pack member, their deaths at Shadowmere Gates could ignite conflicts that would consume both territories in blood. But accepting them carried equal danger. Housing Blackthorn refugees would be seen as an act of aggression, a calculated insult that demanded retaliation. Aldrich's pride was legendary, his memory for slights measured in generations rather than years. War seemed inevitable either way. The only choice was whether it would be fought over 7 small graves or 7 living reminders of ancient enmities. The pack comes first. Magnus had built his entire leadership philosophy on that foundation. 37 lives depended on his ability to make hard choices without sentiment clouding his judgment. He'd proven that commitment through years of careful isolation, maintaining the distance necessary to weigh costs in lives rather than hearts. Yet as he looked at these children, his children, that carefully constructed philosophy began crumbling like sandcastles before rising tide. The protective instinct that rose in his chest felt primal, undeniable, stronger than any rational calculation of risk and benefit. It was the same fierce drive that had made him fight to the death defending pack territory, the same merciless devotion that had sustained him through 15 years of self-imposed exile. I failed Elena. I failed my first chance at family. The memory of that terrible night pressed against his consciousness. Elena's terrified face, his wolf form standing over her broken body, the moment when love became nightmare. He'd sworn never to risk such devastation again, had built walls around his heart that these children were somehow breaching with nothing more than their existence. "Sir?" Garrett prompted gently. "The children need warmth and food. Whatever your decision, they require immediate care." Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of leadership settle over him like a familiar cloak. When he opened them again, 7 small faces watched him with mingled hope and terror, children who'd gambled everything on blood ties they couldn't prove to a father who'd forgotten their very existence. The moment stretched between heartbeats, suspended like snow before the avalanche. Whatever choice he made would echo through generations, would either forge a new future or destroy the carefully ordered world he'd built from the ashes of his past. Choose. The word hung in the mountain air like a blade poised to fall. Magnus felt the eyes of his pack upon him, felt the weight of 15 years of careful isolation pressing against this single moment of truth. Behind him lay everything he'd built from duty and sacrifice. Before him stood 7 children whose very existence shattered the foundations of his ordered world. "Choose. Bring them inside," Magnus said quietly, and felt his old life die. The words left him with the finality of a funeral bell. No calculation had preceded them, no careful weighing of political costs against moral obligations. The command rose from somewhere deeper than strategy, from the primal core of what it meant to be Alpha, to be father, to be the man he'd forgotten he could become. Garrett's sharp intake of breath spoke volumes, but the sentinel moved without hesitation. "You heard the Alpha King. Get blankets from the hall. Heat broth in the kitchens. Move." Pack members scattered to obey, their confusion palpable but their loyalty absolute. Magnus watched them go, knowing that each step these children took across his threshold would bind his pack's fate to choices he couldn't yet comprehend. There would be no taking this back, no careful retreat to the safety of isolation. He'd opened a door that would never close again. The eldest boy, his son, Magnus forced himself to think the impossible word, stepped forward first. His siblings followed in order of age, a practiced formation that spoke of journeys taken together, hardships shared. They moved like a pack themselves, these 7 small wolves who'd learned survival in enemy territory. "Thank you," the boy said simply as he crossed the threshold. 2 words that carried the weight of desperate hope finally answered. Magnus found his voice lodged somewhere behind the avalanche of implications crashing through his mind. "What's your name?" "Duncan, sir. Duncan Blackthorne." The boy's chin lifted with quiet pride. "Though Mother said we might choose different names if you'd have us." Different names. The concept struck Magnus like lightning illuminating a storm-dark landscape. These children bore the Blackthorne surname that marked them as enemies, carried the scent signatures that would forever mark them as outcasts. Yet they'd risked everything to reach him, gambling their lives on memories he couldn't access and blood ties he'd forgotten. The smallest girl stumbled as she entered, her legs too weak from cold and hunger to carry her further. Magnus moved without thinking, catching her before she could fall. The moment his hands touched her small shoulders, the world exploded into light. Memory cascaded through him like breaking floodwaters. Autumn moonlight filtering through ancient pines. A woman with auburn hair and laughing eyes, her blackthorn scent masked by wildflowers and desire. Hands that welcomed instead of feared. Lips that spoke his name like prayer rather than curse. The moon madness that stripped away years of careful control, leaving only raw hunger and unexpected tenderness. "I never thought I could feel this again," his own voice whispered in memory. "Nor I," she replied, fingers tracing scars across his chest. "Perhaps the moon gives second chances to those brave enough to take them." Days that blurred into nights. Conversations that ranged from pack politics to half-forgotten legends, laughter that came easier than it had since Elena's death. And through it all, the growing certainty that what they'd found together was worth any price the world might demand. Then nothing. Blank space where memories should be, as if someone had carved those weeks from his mind with surgical precision. Magnus gasped, staggering under the weight of recovered truth. 7 children. 7 living proofs of love he'd been forced to forget, of choices made by a version of himself who'd believed in second chances. "The magic," Duncan said quietly, watching his father's face with ancient understanding. "Mother said it would hurt when you remembered." Magnus looked down at the child in his arms. Elena, they'd named her Elena, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The protective walls he'd built around his heart didn't crumble, they transformed, expanding to encompass 7 small lives that had always belonged to him. "Take them to the eastern wing," he commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos rewriting his soul. "The room's near mine. They'll need clothes, food, medical attention." He paused, meeting Garrett's wide-eyed stare. "And they'll need protection. Aldrich Blackthorne will come for them." "Alpha King," Garrett began carefully. "The pack will want to understand." "The pack will understand what they need to understand," Magnus cut him off. The familiar weight of command settled over his shoulders, but it felt different now, heavier, more purposeful. "These children are under my direct protection. Anyone who threatens them threatens me personally." He set little Elena gently on her feet, watching as Duncan gathered his siblings like a shepherd protecting his flock. 7 faces turned toward him, expectant, hopeful, terrified. Children who'd crossed impossible distances to find a father who'd forgotten their very existence. Magnus Thornfield, Alpha King of Shadowmere, looked at his unexpected family and felt the last chains of his old life snap like winter branches under spring's weight. Ahead lay war, chaos, and challenges he couldn't imagine, but for the first time in 15 years, ahead also lay the possibility of redemption. The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back. The great hall of Shadowmere had never felt smaller. Magnus stood watching his children disappear up the stone staircase with Garrett's wife, their small forms dwarfed by the ancient architecture that had sheltered his pack for 3 centuries. The sound of their footsteps echoed off vaulted ceilings like whispered promises of chaos to come. "Alpha King." The voice belonged to Henrik Stoneclaw, his second-in-command and oldest pack member. The grizzled warrior emerged from the shadows near the hearth, his weathered face carved from granite and suspicion. "We need to talk." Magnus turned, noting the careful positioning of the dozen pack members who'd filtered into the hall. Not quite a confrontation, but far from casual gathering. They'd arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, close enough to show unity, distant enough to retreat if his legendary temper surfaced. The political implications weren't lost on him. "Speak freely, Henrik. You've earned that right." Magnus kept his voice level, though every instinct screamed at him to assert dominance. These people had followed him through 15 years of careful isolation. They deserved explanations, not commands born from paternal panic. "7 Blackthorn children now sleep under our roof," Henrik began, his tone respectful but uncompromising. "The youngest bears your scent so clearly that my wolf recognizes it without question. Yet none of us knew you'd taken a mate from enemy territory." The accusation hung unspoken but obvious. Alpha Kings didn't conduct secret affairs that produced heirs. The pack's survival depended on transparency and leadership, on knowing their leaders' weaknesses and loyalties. Magnus had violated that sacred trust, regardless of forgotten memories or magical interference. "I didn't know either," Magnus said simply. The admission felt like stripped skin, raw and vulnerable. The memories were taken from me. Only when I touched the youngest did they begin returning. "Convenient," muttered someone from the back. Magnus's enhanced hearing caught the whisper, but he let it pass. Fear made people cruel, and his pack had every reason for fear. "Magic powerful enough to alter an Alpha King's memories," Henrik continued, "suggests involvement from the old bloodlines. The Thornfield archives speak of such things, binding spells that could rewrite history itself." His gray eyes sharpened, which means someone wanted this connection forgotten, someone with resources and motivation we can't begin to guess. Magnus felt a chill that had nothing to do with Highland winter. Henrik was right. The magic that had stolen months from his memory required power he couldn't comprehend, power that belonged to the ancient families who'd ruled these mountains before recorded history, whose descendants still moved through Highland politics like ghosts. "There's more," Henrik continued. "Young Tobias returned from his patrol an hour ago. He's brought news." A lean youth stepped forward from the circle, his face flushed with excitement and terror. Magnus recognized him as the youngest of his scouts, barely old enough for border duty, but possessed of the sharp eyes and swift feet that made for excellent intelligence gathering. "Alpha King, I saw riders on the southern approach, 40 mounted wolves bearing Blackthorn standards. They're making camp at Raven's Hollow, just beyond our territorial markers." Tobias swallowed hard. "Aldrich Blackthorn leads them personally." The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of logs in the great fireplace. 40 riders represented nearly half of Blackthorn's military strength, a force sufficient to siege Shadowmere's walls or die trying. That Aldrich had come personally elevated this from territorial dispute to blood vendetta. "How long before they reach our gates?" Magnus asked. 2 hours, maybe 3, if they maintain their current pace. They're not trying to hide their approach." "Because they want us to know they're coming," Henrik observed grimly. "This isn't a rescue mission for the children. It's a statement." Magnus nodded, his mind already shifting into the tactical framework that had kept his pack alive for 15 years. Shadowmere's defenses were formidable. Ancient stone walls built to withstand siege, elevated position that made assault costly, and 37 pack members who'd proven their loyalty in blood. Against 40 Blackthorn riders, they could hold indefinitely. But holding wasn't winning. Siege warfare favored whoever could endure longest, and Aldrich commanded resources that stretched far beyond his personal warband. The Blackthorn territory encompassed 3 valleys and twice Shadowmere's population. They could rotate fresh forces while Magnus's pack slowly starved. "There's something else," Tobias continued hesitantly. "I recognize some of the riders from the autumn gatherings. They're not all Blackthorns. I saw Mac-ready colors and possibly Ravencrest standards. This isn't just Aldrich's personal guard." Henrik cursed under his breath. "A coalition force. He's convinced other packs that housing his refugees represents a threat to Highland stability." Magnus felt the walls closing in around him. 7 children sleeping in the eastern wing had transformed from personal revelation into political catastrophe. By accepting them, he'd inadvertently declared himself an enemy of Highland order itself. "The children stay," he said quietly, and watched his pack absorb the implications. "Whatever comes next, They remain under Shadowmere protection. Henrik studied his face for a long moment, reading the unshakable determination written there. Finally, the old warrior nodded. Then we prepare for war. The words settled over the hall like a death shroud. Magnus watched the faces of his pack members shift from uncertainty to grim acceptance. 37 souls who'd chosen to follow him into whatever darkness lay ahead. The fire crackled in the sudden silence, its warmth feeling futile against the cold reality of approaching war. "Henrik, take 12 riders and secure the mountain passes," Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had kept them alive through countless conflicts. "If Aldrich has convinced other packs to join him, we can't afford to let them control our escape routes." The old warrior nodded, already moving toward the weapons cache. "What about the children? They're my responsibility." Magnus felt the weight of that truth settle in his bones. "Station guards outside their quarters, but keep them discreet. I won't have my own sons and daughters feeling like prisoners." As his pack dispersed to their tasks, Magnus climbed the stone stairs toward the eastern wing. Each step carried him further from the man he'd been this morning, the careful, controlled leader who'd built his entire existence on emotional distance. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, a shadow who'd forgotten what it meant to have something worth dying for. The corridor outside the children's quarters was already under guard. 2 of his most trusted sentinels stood at attention, their weapons loose but ready. They nodded as he passed, questions burning in their eyes that he couldn't yet answer. Magnus paused outside the heavy oak door, hearing soft voices within. His enhanced senses picked up the children's scents: fear, exhaustion, and something else, hope. Despite everything they'd endured, despite the uncertainty of their reception, they still carried hope like a flickering candle in winter darkness. He knocked gently before entering. The scene that greeted him stopped him cold. 7 children sat in a rough circle on the stone floor, sharing a simple meal that his people had prepared. The eldest, Duncan, was carefully portioning bread to ensure the youngest ate first. They'd washed and changed into clothes that hung loose on their thin frames, but their movements still carried the careful efficiency of survivors who'd learned to waste nothing. "Father?" The word came from Elena, the smallest girl whose touch had shattered his forgotten memories. She looked up at him with eyes that held far too much understanding for her apparent age. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," Magnus said, his throat tight with emotions he'd thought dead and buried, "and to explain what's going to happen." Duncan set down his bread, his young face serious. "Uncle Aldrich is coming, isn't he? We heard the commotion downstairs." Magnus studied his eldest son. The boy carried himself with authority that reminded him painfully of his own youth, before grief and guilt had carved the idealism from his bones. "Yes, he'll be here within hours, with enough riders to make this conversation very complicated." "He'll want us back," said one of the middle children, a boy with auburn hair who bore striking resemblance to memories Magnus was still recovering. "He promised Mother we'd never see you, said you'd reject us like garbage." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Magnus like a physical blow. He knelt beside the circle, bringing himself to their eye level. "Whatever Aldrich told you, whatever he made you believe, you are not garbage. You're my children, and you're under my protection now. Even if it means war?" Duncan's question carried weight beyond his years. Magnus met his son's storm-gray gaze and saw his own stubbornness reflected there. Especially then. A soft knock interrupted them. Garrett's wife, Mary, peered around the door with an apologetic expression. "Alpha King? I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's been a development." Magnus rose, noting how the children unconsciously moved closer together at the interruption. Survival instincts learned through harsh experience. "What is it?" A rider approached under a parley banner. "He bears a message from Aldrich Blackthorn." Mary's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would change everything. "He requests a meeting before his forces advance. Sunset at the old standing stones, neutral ground." The children's faces went pale. Even little Elena seemed to understand the implications. This was their uncle offering one final chance for Magnus to surrender them peacefully before blood began to flow. "Tell the rider I'll be there," Magnus said. He turned back to his children, seeing his own determination reflected in 7 pairs of eyes. "I need you to stay here, stay safe. Whatever happens at that meeting, remember this, I chose to keep you. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to." Duncan nodded slowly. "We understand, Father." As Magnus left the room, he carried with him the image of 7 small faces watching him with trust he'd done nothing yet to earn. The burden felt heavier than any crown, more precious than any throne. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks. In 2 hours he would face Aldrich Blackthorn and learn the true price of recovered memories. But first, he had a war to prepare for. The armory of Shadowmere had witnessed 15 years of careful maintenance, weapons kept sharp for conflicts that never came. Now Magnus moved through the familiar space with purpose that felt both foreign and inevitable, selecting blades and armor for a confrontation that would determine whether his pack survived the night. His hands found the ancient sword that had belonged to his father, Moonshard, forged from Highland steel and quenched in wolf's blood during the clan wars of his grandfather's time. The weapon hummed with ancestral power as he lifted it, responding to Thornfield bloodline like a lover recognizing touch. Tonight, it would taste battle again. Alpha King. Henrik appeared in the doorway, his own weapons secured and battle-scarred face grim. The passes are secured, but Tobias brings more news. The coalition force has grown. He counts 60 riders now, with more arriving by the hour. Magnus paused in his preparations. 60 riders transformed this from territorial dispute into full-scale war. Aldrich hadn't come seeking negotiation. He'd come to end the Shadowmere pack entirely, using the children as justification for annihilation. "What of our allies?" Magnus asked, though he suspected the answer. Silent. The MacLeod sent polite refusal, citing neutrality. The Greystone pack hasn't responded at all. Henrik's voice carried bitter understanding. "We stand alone." The isolation shouldn't have surprised him. Magnus had spent 15 years building walls between Shadowmere and the Highland political structure, preferring solitude to the messy complications of alliance. That choice felt catastrophically short-sighted now, as 60 enemy riders gathered beyond his borders while potential friends maintained careful distance. "Then, we make our stand with what we have," Magnus said, buckling Moonshard to his hip. The familiar weight felt like coming home, 37 wolves against 60. "We faced worse odds." Henrik's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Aye, but never for stakes this personal." They emerged from the armory to find Shadowmere transformed. Pack members moved with efficient urgency, securing defenses and checking weapons with the fluid coordination of wolves who'd trained together for years. Children and elderly were already moving toward the inner keep, while fighters took positions along the ancient walls. But Magnus's attention fixed on an unexpected sight near the main courtyard. Duncan stood arguing quietly with one of the guards, his young face set with determination that sent ice through his father's veins. "What's happening here?" Magnus demanded, striding toward the confrontation. The guard, a reliable warrior named Finn, looked relieved at his approach. "The boy insists on fighting, Alpha King. Says he won't hide while others die for his presence." Magnus studied his eldest son, seeing familiar stubbornness in storm-gray eyes that mirrored his own. Duncan had secured a sword somehow, the blade nearly as tall as his thin frame but held with surprising competence. The sight triggered a cascade of protective fury that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. "You'll return to your quarters immediately," Magnus commanded, using the tone that had ended pack disputes for 15 years. Duncan's chin lifted in defiance. "No." The simple word hung between them like drawn steel. Magnus felt his wolf rise in response to challenge, alpha dominance demanding immediate submission. But Duncan held his ground with quiet courage that transformed anger into something more complex, pride mixed with terror, admiration shadowed by desperate fear. "I won't watch from windows while good people die because we exist," Duncan continued, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was defying. "We brought this war to your door. The least I can do is help fight it. You're 12 years old." The words came out rougher than Magnus intended, scraped raw by emotions he'd forgotten how to process. "Mother was teaching me sword work since I was 8, Duncan replied. Someone had to protect the others when she couldn't. He adjusted his grip on the unfamiliar blade, revealing calluses that spoke of harsh necessity rather than childhood games. I know I'm not much, but I can hold a wall position. Free up an experienced fighter for where they're needed most." Magnus looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not the frightened child who'd collapsed at his gates this morning, but a young warrior forged by circumstances no child should endure. Duncan had spent years as protector and provider, shouldering responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. The idea of stepping back while others fought would feel like betrayal of everything he'd been forced to become. "The others remain safely inside," Magnus said finally, each word feeling like stepping off a cliff. "You stay beside me at all times. You follow orders without question or hesitation, and if I tell you to run, you run." Duncan's face blazed with fierce gratitude. "Yes, Alpha King." Henrik muttered something uncomplimentary under his breath, but Magnus caught the old warrior's nod of grudging approval. In pack culture, courage earned respect regardless of age. The sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Soon, he would ride to meet Aldrich Blackthorn at the ancient stones, carrying the weight of his pack's survival and his children's future. Everything he'd learned about love and loss, about the price of isolation and the cost of connection, would be tested in whatever came next. The ordeal had truly begun. The ancient standing stones cast long shadows across the highland moor as Magnus approached the parley ground, Duncan riding silent beside him on a sturdy highland pony. The circular arrangement of weathered granite had witnessed countless negotiations over the centuries, but none that carried the weight of this moment. The neutral ground felt charged with ancestral power, old magic thrumming beneath the frost-hardened earth. Aldrich Blackthorn waited with obvious impatience, his 40 riders arranged in a precise crescent behind him. The man looked exactly as Magnus remembered, lean and sharp-featured, with silver-streaked hair and eyes like winter ice. But there was something else now, a bitter satisfaction that made Magnus's wolf prowl restlessly beneath his skin. "Magnus," Aldrich called as they approached, his voice carrying across the stone circle with mocking familiarity. "Still playing the noble fool, I see. And you've brought one of the whelps to watch his father's downfall." Duncan's grip tightened on his reins, but he remained silent as instructed. Magnus felt pride war with terror at his son's composure, 12 years old and facing down a force that could destroy them all, yet showing no fear. "You called for parley," Magnus said, dismounting within the stone circle. Ancient pack law protected this ground. No blood could be shed here without invoking curses that stretched back to the founding of the Highland clans. "Speak your terms." Aldrich's smile was all teeth and cruelty. "Simple enough. Return what you've stolen, submit to judgment for your crimes, and perhaps your pack lives to see tomorrow's dawn." "The children aren't stolen property." Magnus kept his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "They're under Shadowmere protection now. Those bastards belong to Blackthorn territory by right of birth and upbringing." Aldrich stepped closer, his scent carrying the metallic edge of anticipated violence. "Their whore of a mother died under my protection after you abandoned her to raise your spawn alone." The words hit like physical blows. Magnus felt his carefully maintained control cracking, memories of the woman who'd borne his children rising like ghosts. He still couldn't recall her face clearly, but the guilt of her death, dying alone while he lived in ignorant isolation, threatened to buckle his knees. "You remember now, don't you?" Aldrich continued, circling like a predator sensing weakness. "The spell is breaking down. Soon you'll recall every detail of what you did, how you forced yourself on her during Moon Madness, how you fled when she tried to tell you about the children, how she died calling your name while you hid behind Shadowmere's walls." Each word was precisely chosen, designed to wound. Magnus felt his world tilting as fragments of recovered memory aligned into a devastating picture. Not the forbidden love affair he'd imagined, but something darker, a violation committed during the mindless fury of transformation, consequences abandoned and forgotten through magical manipulation. That's not, Magnus began, but Aldrich's laughter cut him off. The great Alpha King, reduced to stammering denials. Do you know what she named them originally? Each child carries your mark, not of love, but of violence. She spent 12 years raising living reminders of her worst night. Duncan's sharp intake of breath was audible across the stone circle. Magnus turned to see his son's face draining of color, young features twisting with horror and betrayal. In the space of heartbeats, the boy's perception of their reunion transformed from miracle to nightmare. "Duncan, listen to me," Magnus started, reaching toward his son, but the damage was done. Duncan jerked his pony backward, storm-gray eyes wide with revulsion. "Is it true? Did you—" The question died unfinished, but its implications hung in the air like poison. Magnus watched 12 years of protective love crumble as Duncan processed Aldrich's revelation. His eldest son, the brave boy who'd stood ready to die defending Shadowmere, now looked at him like a monster. "The children come with me," Aldrich declared with vicious satisfaction. "They'll learn the truth about their precious father, and justice will finally be served." Magnus's hand found Moonshard's hilt, but the gesture felt hollow. Even if he could defeat 60 riders, which he couldn't, how could he fight for children who now knew the horror of their conception? How could he ask his pack to die for bastards born of violence rather than love? Duncan turned his pony toward Aldrich's forces, his young shoulders rigid with betrayal. "I'll go with you," he said quietly. "The others too. We won't let innocent people die for what we represent." The words shattered Magnus's heart more completely than any blade could have managed. His son, brave, honorable Duncan, was choosing exile over the contamination of association with his father's crimes. The reunion Magnus had begun to treasure transformed into the cruelest rejection imaginable. As his eldest son rode toward the enemy lines, Magnus understood that Aldrich had already won. The battle for Shadowmere would be meaningless now. He'd lost everything that mattered before the first sword was drawn. The revelation. Wait. The word tore from Magnus's throat like a battle cry, halting Duncan's retreat toward Aldrich's forces. The ancient stone seemed to pulse with gathered power as Magnus stepped forward, his wolf surging to the surface with protective fury that bordered on madness. "If you're going to destroy me with lies, at least have the courage to speak them completely." Aldrich's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. "What lies? You remember now, the moon madness, the violence, her screams." "I remember fragments poisoned by your manipulation." Magnus's voice carried the authority of 15 years ruling Shadowmere, cutting through Aldrich's gloating like a blade. "But I also remember something else, something you hoped I'd never recover." The older Alpha's confidence flickered almost imperceptibly, but Magnus caught the shift. His enhanced senses detected the slightest change in Aldrich's scent, the metallic edge of anticipated violence now tainted with something sharper. Fear. "You were there that night," Magnus continued, pieces of shattered memory beginning to align into a different pattern entirely. "Not just afterward to rescue her. You were there during my transformation." Duncan had stopped his retreat, turning back to watch with desperate confusion etched across his young features. The 60 riders shifted restlessly, sensing the change in atmosphere without understanding its source. "The spell work that stole my memories," Magnus pressed on, his wolf's fury crystallizing into cold certainty. "It wasn't just to make me forget the children. It was to hide your part in what happened that night." Aldrich's composure cracked like ice over deep water. "You're grasping at shadows, desperate to avoid the truth." "Am I?" Magnus stepped closer, noting how Aldrich unconsciously retreated despite his numerical advantage. "Because I'm starting to remember her face now. Isla Mac Bride. Not some random woman caught by moon madness, but your intended mate. The alliance marriage that would have secured Blackthorn power over the northern passes." The name hit Aldrich like a physical blow. Magnus saw recognition flare in his enemy's eyes, followed immediately by rage that confirmed his growing suspicions. "She came to warn me that night," Magnus continued, memories flooding back with painful clarity now that he'd identified the magical barriers. Came to warn me about the poison you'd been feeding me for weeks. Nightshade and silver dust, designed to trigger violent transformation during the new moon. Duncan's sharp intake of breath was audible across the stone circle. The boy's horror was transforming into something else, confusion, then dawning hope as his father's words painted a different picture entirely. "You wanted me to kill her," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the moor with devastating certainty. "Wanted the Northern Pax to unite against Shadowmere for murdering an innocent woman during peace negotiations. But your plan failed, didn't it? Because even in moon madness, even poisoned and mindless, I recognized her as someone to protect rather than destroy." Aldrich's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady. "Convenient delusions won't save you. She stayed with me through 3 nights of transformation." Magnus pressed on, the recovered memories blazing now with perfect clarity. "Kept me anchored when the poison should have driven me completely feral. And on the 3rd night, when the madness finally broke," he paused, meeting Duncan's desperate gaze. "When the madness finally broke, we chose each other. Not violence, love." The word rang across the ancient stones like a bell, cutting through 15 years of guilt and lies. Magnus felt the last barriers in his memory shatter completely, revealing the truth that magical manipulation had hidden, not assault born of madness, but passion born of shared danger and mutual choice. "The spell work wasn't meant to hide crimes," Magnus continued, his voice gaining strength with each recovered detail. "It was meant to hide the fact that Isla chose me over you, that she carried my children by choice, not force, that your grand alliance crumbled because she saw through your poisoning and chose to stand with Shadowmere instead." Aldrich's composure finally shattered entirely. "She was mine by right, promised to me since childhood." "She was her own," Magnus replied quietly. "And she chose to love me despite your poison, despite the danger, despite everything you put us through." Duncan's pony moved forward unconsciously, the boy's face transforming as understanding replaced horror. Not children of violence, but children of a love so powerful it had overcome magical manipulation and political pressure. "The real question," Magnus said, his hand settling on Moonshard's hilt with renewed purpose, "is what happened to her afterward. Because Isla wouldn't have died from childbirth complications. She was too strong, too determined to protect what we'd created together." Aldrich's silence was answer enough. The guilty knowledge burning in his winter-cold eyes confirmed what Magnus's heart had already recognized. His mate hadn't died from natural causes. She'd been murdered by a man who couldn't bear the rejection of his carefully laid plans. Everything shifted. The parley ground, the gathered forces, the very air itself seemed to hold its breath, as Magnus felt 15 years of imposed guilt transform into righteous fury. Aldrich had stolen more than memories. He'd stolen love, family, and 15 years of happiness. Now there would be a reckoning. The transformation was immediate and total. Magnus felt the weight of 15 years' worth of lies lifting from his shoulders like chains finally broken, replaced by a burning clarity that set his wolf howling with vindicated rage. The guilty knowledge in Aldrich's eyes had confirmed what his heart already knew. Isla hadn't simply died. She'd been murdered by the man who'd orchestrated their separation, poisoned their love, and stolen their family. "You killed her," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the stone circle with quiet devastation. Not a question, a statement of absolute certainty that made Aldrich flinch as if struck. Duncan urged his pony forward, no longer retreating toward the enemy, but moving to his father's side. The boy's face blazed with fierce understanding, storm-gray eyes reflecting the same righteous fury that burned in Magnus's chest. "That's why you kept us alive," Duncan said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of revelation. "You needed us as weapons against him. Living proof of what you claimed he'd done." Magnus felt his heart swell with pride at his son's quick comprehension. Even at 12, Duncan possessed the strategic mind of a born alpha, seeing through layers of deception to the truth beneath. The boy had endured 12 years of manipulation, raised to believe his father was a monster, yet now stood ready to fight beside the man he'd learned to trust in a single morning. "Clever children," Aldrich snarled, his mask of civilized negotiation finally dropping completely. Too clever for their own good, just like their whore mother. The insult ignited something primal in Magnus's chest. His wolf surged forward with protective fury that threatened to tear through his human restraint, but he held on to control with iron will. Raw emotion wouldn't serve him now. He needed the calculated precision that had kept Shadowmere strong for 15 years. Henrik was right, Magnus said, pieces of strategy falling into place with crystalline clarity. You never intended to negotiate. This parley was meant to break me psychologically before the battle even began. Make me doubt myself, question everything, surrender without fighting back. Aldrich's riders shifted restlessly behind him, hands moving toward weapons as the pretense of diplomatic solution crumbled. Magnus noted their positions, counted escape routes, calculated odds with the detached precision of a warrior who'd survived countless battles. 60 against 2 seemed impossible, until he remembered that impossible odds had never stopped him before. But you made one critical mistake, Magnus continued, his hand settling on Moonshard's familiar grip. You underestimated what truth could accomplish. My son knows now that he wasn't born of violence but of love. My pack will learn that their alpha isn't a monster but a father fighting to protect his family. And I. He drew the ancient blade in one fluid motion, its steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. I remember exactly who I'm fighting for. Duncan's face blazed with sudden understanding. The others. Aldrich doesn't just have warriors, he has the other children too. They're probably hidden somewhere close, waiting to see who wins. Magnus felt his tactical awareness sharpen to a razor's edge. Of course Aldrich would keep the leverage close. 7 children represented 7 reasons for Magnus to surrender, 7 innocent lives hanging in the balance. But they also represented something else, 7 more reasons to fight with everything he possessed. Signal Henrik, Magnus told Duncan quietly, never taking his eyes off Aldrich's forces. 3 long howls, then 2 short. He'll know what it means. Duncan tilted his head back and released the calls with surprising power for his young lungs. The sound echoed across the highland moor like a war horn, carrying ancient harmonics that spoke to every wolf within hearing. Magnus felt his heart swell as the calls were answered from multiple directions, not just Shadowmere's walls, but from the forests and crags surrounding the stone circle. Aldrich's confident sneer faltered as he realized what the signals meant. Impossible. Our scouts confirmed Shadowmere's numbers. Your scouts saw what we wanted them to see, Magnus said with grim satisfaction. 37 wolves within the walls. But Highland packs have alliances that stretch back centuries. Touch one of us, threaten our children, and you face them all. The first reinforcements emerged from concealment among the standing stones, Mac-Leod warriors with their distinctive tartan and silver-traced weapons. Then came the Cameron fighters from the eastern passes, followed by the fierce Mackenzie clan matriarchs whose mere presence made Aldrich's horses shy nervously. Magnus watched his enemy's numerical advantage evaporate as Highland honor answered Shadowmere's call. These weren't hired swords or political allies, they were packmates in the truest sense, wolves who'd stood together against Saxon encroachment and clan warfare for generations. Your move, Aldrich, Magnus said, raising Moonshard until its point caught the dying sunlight. But choose carefully. You're no longer facing a broken alpha questioning his own memories. You're facing a father who remembers exactly what you took from him. The battlefield was set. Now came the reckoning. The winter wind shifted across the stone circle, carrying the scent of approaching snow and the metallic tang of weapons drawn in anger. Aldrich's eyes darted between the emerging Highland forces, his calculated confidence crumbling as he realized the trap he'd walked into. What should have been a simple retrieval of stolen property had become something far more dangerous, a challenge to the very foundation of his power. You think these northern savages will stand against Blackthorn's might? Aldrich snarled, but Magnus caught the tremor beneath his bravado. I have allies of my own, treaties signed in blood and silver. Then call them, Magnus replied, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had earned him 15 years of uncontested rule. But understand what you're truly invoking. This isn't about territorial disputes or political alliances anymore. This is about justice for a murdered woman and the children she died protecting. The MacLeod chief, a grizzled warrior named Tormund, whose scars spoke of countless battles, stepped forward with deliberate menace. Magnus Thornfield calls in old debts, he announced, his Highland brogue thick with promise of violence. MacLeod answers, as do Cameron, Mackenzie, and every pack that remembers honor. Duncan moved his pony closer to his father's position, the boy's young face set with determination that made Magnus's heart clench with pride and terror in equal measure. His son was choosing to stand in the crucible of violence, accepting the risk that came with claiming Thornfield blood. The courage required for such a decision at 12 years old humbled Magnus completely. "Where are the others?" Magnus asked Aldrich, his enhanced senses searching for traces of his remaining children. "6 more innocents you're using as shields. Even you wouldn't be craven enough to harm children directly, but you'd let them suffer while you played your games." Aldrich's slight glance toward the eastern ridge betrayed him before he could craft a lie. Magnus filed the information away with grim satisfaction. 200 yards from the stone circle, probably in one of the shepherd's bothies that dotted these moors. Close enough for leverage, far enough to avoid immediate rescue. "They're safe, as long as you're reasonable," Aldrich said, confirming Magnus's suspicions. "Surrender yourself for judgment, and they'll be raised properly in Blackthorn territory. Continue this charade and—" He shrugged with calculated indifference. The threat hung in the Highland air like poison, but Magnus felt only clarifying rage. Every word from Aldrich's mouth revealed new depths of manipulation. Using children as weapons, murdering their mother, stealing 15 years of love and family through magical deception. The accumulated weight of crimes demanded more than justice. It demanded retribution. "You made one final mistake," Magnus said, his wolf beginning to strain against human restraint as battle instincts awakened. "You assumed I was still the broken alpha you created through lies and manipulation. But I remember now. I remember what I'm truly capable of when protecting what I love." The transformation began slowly, deliberately, not the violent eruption of moon madness, but the controlled shift of a master who'd learned to harness rather than be consumed by his wolf's power. Magnus felt his senses expanding, his strength multiplying, his connection to every Highland warrior around the circle deepening into pack-bond solidarity. Duncan watched with wide eyes as his father's human facade melted away to reveal the predator beneath. Not a monster, Magnus kept careful control, ensuring his son saw strength rather than brutality, but something infinitely dangerous when cornered. The boy's scent carried no fear, only fierce pride in finally witnessing his heritage unleashed. "Signal positions," Magnus commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to wolf instincts. The Highland warriors began moving with practiced precision, surrounding Aldrich's forces while maintaining clear lines of retreat toward the hidden children. This wouldn't be a massacre. It would be surgical removal of a threat that had poisoned their lands for too long. Aldrich's riders drew steel with the desperate efficiency of men who'd realized their numerical advantage meant nothing against coordinated pack tactics. But their leader made no move toward weapons, his winter-cold eyes fixed on Magnus with an expression that mingled hatred and something approaching respect. "You want your precious children back?" Aldrich called, his voice carrying across the moor with malicious promise. "Come and take them, but know that every step you take toward victory is paid for in blood, Highland blood, innocent blood, the same blood that's been spilled for your mistakes since this began." Magnus felt the weight of leadership settle across his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Every decision carried consequences, every choice demanded payment in suffering from those who followed him. But some fights couldn't be avoided, not when fundamental principles stood at stake. He raised Moonshard toward the darkening sky, its ancient steel catching the last rays of sunlight like captured fire. Around the stone circle, Highland voices lifted in response, not words but something deeper, older, more primal. The sound of pack bonds forged in battle and tempered by shared sacrifice. The final confrontation had begun. The ancient stones amplified the Highland war cries until they became something elemental. Wind and thunder given voice through centuries of shared blood. Magnus felt the primal harmony resonate in his bones as he charged forward, moonshard cutting through winter air like judgment itself. This was no longer a parley or negotiation. This was the crucible where 15 years of lies would burn away, leaving only truth carved in steel and sacrifice. Aldrich's riders met them with desperate fury, but their formation shattered against Highland coordination like waves against granite. These weren't hired swords fighting for coin. They were pack warriors defending family, each movement flowing into the next with supernatural precision. Magnus carved through enemy ranks with controlled violence, his wolf-enhanced strength, making armor meaningless while his battle experience kept him moving, flowing, never lingering long enough to be surrounded. Behind him, Duncan's voice rose in the ancient calls, directing friendly forces with tactical brilliance that made Magnus's heart swell even as Moonshard opened another enemy throat. His 12-year-old son was orchestrating a battle with instincts that spoke to generations of Thornfield blood. The boy had found his birthright at last, not through violence, but through the courage to stand for what mattered. The Eastern Ridge, Magnus called to Tormund MacLeod as their paths crossed in the swirling melee. 6 children in the bothy. Get them clear before this ends badly. The grizzled chief nodded grimly and peeled away with half his warriors, leaving Magnus to face the center of Aldrich's collapsing force. Through the chaos of clashing steel and howling voices, Magnus could see his true target, the man who'd murdered Isla, stolen their children, poisoned 15 years with carefully crafted lies. Aldrich had drawn his own blade at last, a curved saber that gleamed with unnatural darkness along its edge. Poison or curse work, Magnus realized with grim appreciation. His enemy hadn't survived decades of political maneuvering without preparing for moments like this, but preparation meant nothing against the righteous fury of a father who finally understood what he'd lost. They came together in the center of the ancient circle with bone-jarring impact, steel singing against steel as their blades locked. Aldrich was skilled. Magnus had to admit that much as he felt the enemy's technique probe for weaknesses. But skill meant nothing against experience earned through centuries of Highland warfare, and Aldrich had spent too many years manipulating from shadows rather than facing honest combat. "You could have had everything," Aldrich snarled as they circled each other, looking for openings. "Power, alliance, peace between our territories. Instead, you chose a worthless girl who wasn't even properly grateful for the honor." Magnus's response was a combination that nearly took Aldrich's head off. The insult to Isla's memory sent wolf rage surging through his veins, but he channeled the fury into precise strikes that backed his enemy toward the largest standing stone. Every recovered memory of his murdered mate fed the fire burning in his chest, her laughter, her courage, the way she'd stood against magical manipulation to protect their growing love. "She saw through your poison," Magnus said, as Moonshard forced Aldrich's guard higher. "Recognized what you were trying to do and chose to stop you. That's why you killed her, not jealousy, not politics. Fear that she'd expose your methods to the other packs." Aldrich's blade work was growing desperate as Highland warriors finished off the last of his riders. Soon, it would be just the two of them, Alpha against Alpha, with nowhere left to hide behind subordinates or political maneuvering. "She was a fool who chose poorly. Just like you." "No," Magnus said, feeling absolute certainty settle in his bones like bedrock. "She chose love over ambition, chose family over power, chose truth over convenient lies." He pressed forward with renewed purpose, each strike carrying 15 years of suppressed grief and rage. "She chose everything you'll never understand." Through the combat haze, Magnus heard new voices joining Duncan's calls, higher, younger, filled with desperate hope. His other children, freed from whatever prison Aldrich had crafted, adding their voices to the Highland chorus. 6 more pieces of his heart returning home, 6 more reasons to end this with absolute finality. Aldrich must have heard them too, because his face twisted with frustrated rage. "You think this changes anything? I have allies, treaties, power that stretches beyond these worthless mountains." "You have nothing," Magnus interrupted. his final combination shattering Aldrich's guard and sending the curved saber spinning away into the heather. No honor, no family, no legacy worth preserving. He pressed Moonshard's point to his enemy's throat with deliberate precision. Just the judgment you've earned through 15 years of poison and lies. The ancient stones stood witness as Magnus Thornfield reclaimed everything that had been stolen. His children, his memories, his right to love and be loved in return. The weight of leadership remained, heavier now with 7 young lives depending on his choices. But for the first time in 15 years, it felt like a privilege rather than a burden. The final test wasn't about combat or tactics or political maneuvering. It was about remembering who he truly was beneath the lies. A father, a protector, an alpha worthy of the trust his pack had never stopped offering. The ancient steel trembled against Aldrich's throat, a hair's breadth from ending 15 years of manipulation and lies. Magnus felt the weight of absolute power in that moment, the choice between justice and vengeance, between the clean finality of death and the harder path of mercy. Around them, the stone circle had fallen silent except for the approaching footsteps of his children, their voices calling his name with desperate hope. "You won't do it," Aldrich whispered, his winter-cold eyes fixed on Magnus with calculating malice even in defeat. "Too much honor, too much Highland nobility. You'll spare me because that's who you are, weak when strength is required." Magnus pressed Moonshard's point deeper, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down Aldrich's pale throat. Every instinct screamed for him to finish this, to ensure his enemy could never again threaten what remained of his family. The wolf within him howled for retribution, for the satisfaction of watching his mate's murderer pay the ultimate price. But Duncan's voice cut through the rage like sunlight through storm clouds. "Father, they're here, all of them, they're safe." Magnus turned his head slightly, keeping Aldrich pinned while his heart nearly shattered at the sight greeting him. 6 children stumbled into the stone circle, escorted by Tormund's warriors, 4 girls and 2 boys ranging from perhaps 6 years old to Duncan's age. Their faces bore the unmistakable stamp of Thornfield blood, the same dark hair and storm-gray eyes that marked his lineage. But more than features, he recognized something deeper, the scent of family, of pack, of belonging that had been torn from his life through magical deception. The youngest, a girl who couldn't be more than 7, broke away from her escort and ran toward him with fearless determination. "Papa?" Duncan said, "You're our papa." The word hit Magnus like a physical blow. Papa. Not the formal father he'd expected, but the intimate address of a child who dreamed of this moment through years of exile and uncertainty. His hand trembled on Moonshard's grip as the little girl approached, her wide eyes taking in the scene of violence with startling composure. "I'm Caitlin," she announced, reaching out to touch his free hand with small fingers that carried Isla's remembered warmth. "Mama told us stories about you. She said you were brave and strong and would find us someday." Magnus felt his wolf-enhanced senses overwhelmed by the flood of scents, sounds, and emotions crashing over him. Each child carried traces of their murdered mother's essence, fragments of the love he'd lost to magical manipulation. But they also carried something uniquely their own, personalities forged through hardship, courage earned through surviving Aldrich's captivity, hope that had somehow endured despite every attempt to crush it. "Stories," he repeated, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "What kind of stories?" "About the Highland King who protected everyone," piped up one of the boys, edging closer despite the battlefield carnage surrounding them. "How you fought monsters and kept the pack safe and loved Mama more than anything in the whole world." Aldrich chose that moment to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that made several children flinch backward, touching reunion. "But you're all fools if you think this ends here. Kill me or spare me, the damage is done. These children have spent years learning that their father abandoned them, that their mother died because of his weakness. You think a few minutes of Highland theatrics can undo that poison?" Magnus felt something shift deep in his chest, a fundamental rebalancing of priorities that went beyond personal vengeance. His enemy was right about one thing: the real battle wouldn't be won through violence. It would be won through proving himself worthy of the trust shining in 7 pairs of young eyes. Perhaps not. Magnus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had held Shadowmere together through decades of challenge. But I have something you never understood. Time, patience, the willingness to earn what can't be taken by force. He stepped back slightly, though Moonshard's point remained steady at Aldrich's throat. These children deserve better than watching their father become a killer in their first moments together. Duncan approached from the other side, his young face blazing with sudden understanding. The old laws, he said with excitement. Highland justice. We don't have to choose between killing him and letting him go free. Magnus felt a grim smile touch his lips, as ancient tradition provided a solution that satisfied both honor and practicality. Exile beyond the Highland boundaries, stripped of pack bonds, forbidden from wolf form, marked so that every supernatural community will know his crimes. He met Aldrich's suddenly fearful eyes, a living death that serves as warning to anyone else who might threaten pack families. The pronouncement carried the weight of centuries, backed by every Highland Alpha who'd ever faced similar choices. Aldrich's face went ashen as he realized the true scope of his punishment. Not clean death, but endless isolation, cut off from everything that made existence meaningful for their kind. Now, Magnus said, finally lowering Moonshard while keeping his enhanced senses focused on any hint of treachery, my children and I have 15 years to catch up on. The moment should have been pure triumph. 7 children safe, their enemy defeated, justice served through ancient law. But as Magnus knelt to embrace his youngest daughter, Caitlyn's small arms wrapping around his neck with desperate trust, he felt the first cold whisper of understanding. Victory always demanded payment, and the bill for this one was coming due faster than he'd anticipated. "Papa," Caitlyn whispered against his ear, her voice carrying the weight of years spent hoping. "Are we really going home with you? To the big castle Duncan told us about?" The innocence in her question made Magnus's chest tighten. Home. Such a simple concept for a child, such an impossible complexity for an Alpha King. He glanced around the stone circle at his other children, saw the same desperate hope reflected in 6 more faces, and felt the cruel mathematics of leadership beginning to calculate costs. Shadowmere could protect them, yes. His fortress was strong enough, his pack loyal enough, his own power sufficient to keep 7 children safe from most threats. But safety for them meant exposure for everyone else. The moment he brought Thornfield blood openly into his territory, every enemy who'd spent 15 years respecting his isolation would see opportunity in his newfound vulnerability. "Tell me about the pack bonds," he said quietly to Duncan, still holding Caitlyn while his mind raced through possibilities. "When you felt the connection awaken, how many others sensed it?" Duncan's face grew troubled as understanding began to dawn. "Dozens, father, maybe more." It rippled outward like a stone thrown in still water. Every supernatural community within leagues would have felt the shift. Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of kingship settling heavier on his shoulders than ever before. His personal joy was about to become his pack's greatest danger. 7 children carrying Thornfield blood, publicly acknowledged after 15 years of careful neutrality. It was like hanging a banner announcing Shadowmere's new weaknesses for every ambitious Alpha to study. "The Blackthorn Alliance networks," Tormund said grimly, approaching with news that confirmed Magnus's worst fears. "Aldrich wasn't working alone. My scouts report movement along the southern borders, war parties that were already mobilized before tonight's confrontation. They were counting on him succeeding, but his failure just means they'll accelerate their own timeline." The eldest of his daughters, a girl of perhaps 14 with Isla's fierce eyes, stepped forward with startling composure. "You're thinking of sending us away again, aren't you? Somewhere safe while you deal with the political consequences of acknowledging us." Her directness hit like a physical blow. This child, Moira, Duncan had called her, had inherited more than Thornfield features. She possessed the tactical intelligence that had made their bloodline legendary, even if she lacked the experience to fully understand what she was suggesting. "The thought had occurred to me," Magnus admitted, refusing to lie to children who'd already endured too many adult deceptions. Hidden sanctuary, trusted guardians, protection until the immediate threats could be neutralized. It would be practical. "It would be cowardice," Moira replied with devastating honesty. "And it would prove Aldrich right about everything. That we're weaknesses to be hidden, rather than strengths to be celebrated. That family means less than political convenience." Around the circle, Magnus felt his Highland warriors watching this exchange with careful attention. These men had followed him through decades of careful isolation, accepting his reasons for avoiding the complexities of family life. Now they were witnessing their Alpha King forced to choose between personal happiness and pack safety, the eternal burden of leadership made manifest. "The children could come to MacLeod territory," Tormund offered reluctantly. "Temporary fostering while you stabilize the political situation. We have defensible positions, trusted allies." "No." The refusal came from Duncan, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "We've been separated long enough. If acknowledging us brings war, then we face that war together, as family, as pack." Magnus felt his wolf howling in agreement, even as his strategic mind catalogued the impossibility of what his son suggested. Shadowmere was strong, but not strong enough to fight the combined forces that would inevitably test their resolve. Keeping his children meant accepting a future measured in constant conflict, endless vigilance, perpetual sacrifice of the peace he'd spent 15 years building. But looking into 7 pairs of eyes that held such desperate hope, such fierce determination to finally belong somewhere, Magnus realized the choice had been made the moment Caitlin whispered Papa against his neck. Some prices were worth paying, regardless of the cost. "Then we go home," he said quietly, feeling the weight of leadership transform into something deeper, the responsibility of fatherhood multiplied 7-fold. All of us, together. The children's faces lit up with joy that made every anticipated battle seem worthwhile. But as Highland voices rose in celebration around the ancient stones, Magnus couldn't escape the knowledge that true victory would be measured not in tonight's triumph, but in whether any of them survived what he'd just chosen to unleash. The celebration lasted only heartbeats before reality reasserted itself with crushing weight. As his children's joyful voices echoed off the ancient stones, Magnus felt the first tremor of what he'd just set in motion, not through the ground beneath his feet, but through the supernatural networks that connected every pack, every alliance, every ambitious alpha who'd spent 15 years watching Shadowmere's carefully maintained neutrality. Duncan's enhanced senses caught it first. The young man's head snapped toward the southern approach, his face draining of color. "Father, they're coming, fast." Multiple packs moving in coordinated formation. Magnus rose smoothly, still holding Caitlin against his chest, while his tactical mind began processing the impossible mathematics of their situation. 7 children who couldn't fight, a dozen Highland warriors already exhausted from tonight's battle, and incoming forces that had clearly been mobilized long before Aldrich's defeat. His enemy's final gambit, ensuring that victory would taste like ash even in triumph. "How many?" he asked Tormund, who was already coordinating with his scouts through hand signals practiced over decades of Highland warfare. 3 separate war parties, at least 40 wolves each. Blackthorn's southern allies, moving fast enough to reach us before dawn. Tormund's scarred face was grim with understanding. They were counting on collecting Aldrich's prize for themselves once he'd done the dangerous work. The irony wasn't lost on Magnus. His children were finally safe from their captor, only to be thrust into immediate mortal peril because of his choice to claim them. Around the stone circle, he could see his warriors calculating odds, checking weapons, preparing for what might be their final battle. Good men who'd followed him faithfully for 15 years, now asked to die for children they'd just met because their Alpha King chose love over strategy. "Papa?" Caitlin's small voice cut through his dark thoughts. "Are the bad men coming for us again?" The innocent question broke something fundamental in Magnus's chest. This child, all 7 of his children, had already endured years of captivity, loss, and fear. They deserved safety, peace, the chance to discover what family meant without the constant shadow of violence. Instead, his acknowledgement of them had painted targets on their backs that would never fully disappear. "Some bad men, yes," he said gently, setting her down while meeting each of his children's eyes in turn. "But this time, you won't face them alone." Moira stepped forward with that inherited Thornfield courage blazing in her young face. "We can fight too. Duncan's already shown wolf form, and some of us are old enough." "No." Magnus's voice carried absolute finality. "Your children, my children, which means protecting you is my responsibility, not the other way around." He looked toward his gathered warriors, seeing understanding pass between men who'd shared battlefields for decades. "Tormund, how defensible is the circle itself? For a short siege, adequate, but 40 against 12. The Mac Leod Alpha shook his head grimly. "We might hold them until reinforcements arrive, if reinforcements were coming." Magnus felt the weight of kingship crystallizing into its purest form. The moment when leadership meant choosing who lived and who died, when every decision carried consequences measured in blood. His children's faces watched him with trust so absolute it was nearly unbearable. They believed their papa could fix anything, protect everyone, find solutions where none existed. The truth was simpler and more terrible. He could save his pack by abandoning his children to their fate. He could save his children by sacrificing every warrior who'd ever followed him. Or he could find a third option that might damn them all but preserved what remained of his honor. "There's another way," Duncan said quietly, his young voice carrying sudden understanding. "The old bonds, Highland law. If you formally acknowledge us not just as family but as pack, we become Shadowmere's responsibility. Every alliance you've built, every treaty you've honored, they all extend to us." Magnus felt his wolf-enhanced senses catch the subtle shift in pack dynamics as his son's words took root. Duncan was right. Formal pack bonds would change the political mathematics entirely. Instead of 7 vulnerable children, they'd become 7 new members of one of the Highlands' most respected territories. Attacking them would mean declaring war on Shadowmere itself, with all the consequences that implied. But it also meant binding his children permanently to a life of constant vigilance, endless threats, perpetual readiness for violence. They'd be safe, but safety would come at the cost of ever knowing true peace. "Is that what you want?" he asked them all, his voice hoarse with emotion. "To be Shadowmere wolves, with everything that means? The protection, yes, but also the responsibilities, the dangers, the weight of carrying our bloodline into an uncertain future?" 7 voices answered as one, young and determined and absolutely certain, yes. Magnus felt ancient pack magic respond to their unified declaration, bonds snapping into place with almost physical intensity. His children, his blood, his pack, finally and forever united under Highland law and supernatural tradition. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The howls echoing from the approaching darkness suggested they wouldn't have long to wait. The howls crescendoed into a symphony of territorial aggression before cutting off with military precision. Magnus felt the sudden silence like a physical weight, his enhanced senses cataloging the subtle sounds of armed forces taking strategic positions around the stone circle. 40 wolves, Duncan had estimated, now close enough that their individual scents carried on the Highland wind, each one bearing the acrid tang of violence barely held in check. "They've stopped," Tormund observed, his scarred hand resting on his claymore's grip. "Professional formation. They're not attacking. They're waiting." Magnus understood the tactical pause, even as it filled him with cold dread. These weren't raiders seeking quick victory. They were calculating predators who'd arrived to find their expected prey transformed into something far more dangerous. 7 Thornfield children had become 7 Shadowmere pack members, protected by 15 years of carefully maintained alliances and supernatural law. The shift in political mathematics would require recalculation. "They're deciding whether we're worth the war," he said quietly, still keeping his children close, while his mind raced through possibilities. Everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat, not just for his family, but for the delicate balance of Highland power that had kept these mountains relatively peaceful since his self-imposed isolation began. A voice carried across the darkness with supernatural clarity, trained to reach the enhanced hearing of gathered wolves. "Magnus Thornfield, we would speak with you under truce banner. There are matters to discuss that concern us all. Magnus recognized the speaker, Garrett Blackthorne, Aldrich's cousin, and current leader of the Southern Confederation, a pragmatist where Aldrich had been a fanatic, but no less dangerous for his calculated approach to Highland politics. The request for formal parley suggested tonight's events had indeed shifted the regional power structure, beyond simple revenge or opportunistic raids. "Stay close," he murmured to his children, then raised his own voice to carry the authority of 15 years' kingship. "I'll hear what you have to say, Blackthorne. Ancient laws govern such meetings." 3 figures emerged from the darkness at the circle's edge, Garrett himself flanked by 2 lieutenants, all maintaining the careful posture of wolves under truce protection. Magnus noted the precise spacing, the weapons worn but not drawn, the subtle signals of supernatural diplomacy played out under starlight and highland mist. Garrett's eyes swept the gathered Thornfield children with calculating intelligence before settling on Magnus himself. "Complicated evening, old friend. When our scouts reported the magical resonance from these stones, we expected to find Aldrich either victorious or dead. We didn't expect to find you expanded." The careful phrasing acknowledged everything while committing to nothing. Magnus felt his children's tension at being discussed like political pieces, saw Duncan's hands clench with inherited Thornfield pride. But this was how leadership functioned at its most essential level, through words that carried the weight of armies, implications that could reshape entire territories. "My family has come home," Magnus replied with quiet finality. "That's not complicated at all." "Your family," Garrett repeated, letting the words settle between them like drawn blades. 7 new Shadowmere wolves, carrying bloodline that makes them valuable to certain interested parties. "You understand the opportunities this creates for those willing to act decisively." The threat was civilized but unmistakable. Magnus felt his wolf stirring with protective fury, carefully suppressed beneath the diplomatic necessities of the moment. Around the circle, his warriors waited with practiced patience, while supernatural politics unfolded according to rules older than written history. "I understand that attacking Shadowmere pack members would constitute an act of war," Magnus said evenly, "with all the consequences such actions traditionally bring." Garrett's smile held no warmth. "Indeed. The question becomes whether those consequences extend beyond your immediate territory, whether your neutrality can survive the complications of acknowledged parenthood." Magnus felt the true shape of tonight's trap revealing itself. Not simple kidnapping or opportunistic violence, but a carefully orchestrated challenge to the isolation that had protected both his pack and the broader Highland peace. His children safe meant his enemies emboldened. His family united meant his alliances tested. Every choice demanded sacrifices he wasn't prepared to make. "Father," Duncan said quietly, his young voice carrying sudden understanding, "they're not here to fight tonight. They're here to force us to choose, between hiding again or accepting that everything changes now." The observation cut to the heart of their situation with uncomfortable precision. Magnus looked at his gathered children, Caitlin still clinging to his hand, Moira standing proud despite her fear, 5 others whose names he was still learning, and felt the weight of fatherhood crystallizing into its most fundamental truth. Some changes couldn't be undone. Some prices were worth paying regardless of cost. "Then we choose," he said simply, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd finally found something more important than political convenience. "Everything changes now." Garrett's expression shifted as he recognized the finality in those words. Around them, the Highland Knight held its breath while 2 alphas faced the moment when diplomacy ended and the real work began. The tension held for 3 heartbeats before Garrett's calculated composure cracked into something approaching respect. "You realize what you're choosing, Thornfield. 15 years of careful neutrality gone. Every ambitious alpha from the Cairngorms to the sea will test your resolve within the month." "Let them come," Magnus replied, feeling the ancient certainty of his bloodline settling into his bones. "They'll find Shadowmere stronger than they remember." Garrett studied the gathered children one final time, his tactical mind clearly weighing possibilities against political realities. Then he stepped back with the fluid grace of a predator, acknowledging superior territory. So be it. But remember, you chose this path when the consequences come calling. The Blackthorn Alpha's withdrawal signaled the end of immediate threat. But Magnus understood it marked the beginning of something far more complex. As hostile forces melted back into Highland darkness, he found himself facing 7 expectant faces that held his entire future in their trust. 3 months later, dawn light filtered through the great hall's ancient windows, illuminating a scene that would have seemed impossible during those long years of self-imposed isolation. Magnus sat at the massive oak table that had once felt too large for solitary meals, now barely adequate for his expanded family. Caitlin occupied her permanent place on his lap, chattering about the wildflowers she intended to pick after breakfast, while Duncan and Moira engaged in heated debate over tactical formations with the intensity only siblings could achieve. The 5 middle children, whose names and personalities Magnus had learned with the patient dedication of a man making up for lost time, filled the remaining chaos with requests for extra porridge, complaints about morning lessons, and the 100 small dramas that comprise daily life with a house full of young Thornfields. "Papa," Caitlin announced with 6-year-old authority, "Seamus said wolves can't climb trees, but I climbed the big oak yesterday, so he's wrong." "Seamus is usually wrong about everything," Moira observed dryly, earning scandalized protest from her brother and approving chuckles from the others. Magnus felt his chest tighten with emotion he was still learning to navigate. These moments, ordinary, chaotic, impossibly precious, represented everything he'd thought lost forever. The children had adapted to Shadowmere's ancient halls with the resilience of youth, transforming cold stone corridors into a home filled with laughter, arguments, and the constant evidence of life fully lived. The political consequences Garrett had promised had indeed materialized. 3 separate challenges to Shadowmere's borders, 2 formal disputes requiring Highland tribunal mediation, and countless smaller tests of Magnus's resolve. But his pack had met each threat with renewed purpose, fighting not just for territory but for the right of their king's children to exist safely in the world. "Father," Duncan said, interrupting Magnus's reflections with characteristic directness, "the Mac Leod messengers are due this afternoon." "About the Summer Alliance gathering." Magnus nodded, already anticipating the delicate negotiations ahead. His public acknowledgement of the children had forced every Highland alliance into recalculation. Old treaties needed updating. New partnerships required careful cultivation, and the eternal work of maintaining peace demanded constant vigilance. But where once such challenges had felt like burdens crushing him toward isolation, they now seemed like obstacles worth overcoming. His children would inherit a Highland changed by their existence, hopefully for the better, but certainly forever altered by the simple fact of their acknowledged place in the world. "We'll face whatever comes," he said simply, words that had become his family's unofficial motto. "Together." Moira looked up from her debate with Duncan, her mother's fierce intelligence blazing in young features that grew more like Isla's every day. "Are you sorry, Papa, about choosing us instead of the easy path?" The question struck him speechless for a moment. Sorry? For mornings filled with childish laughter? For the privilege of teaching Duncan tactical theory and watching Moira master diplomatic nuance? For Caitlin's absolute trust and the daily miracle of being called Papa by voices that carried his blood into the future? "Never," he said with absolute certainty. Not for a single moment. Evening found Magnus standing on Shadowmere's highest battlement, watching mist roll through the mountain valleys while his children's voices echoed from the courtyard below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh tests of the choice he'd made that night among ancient stones. But tonight, his family was safe, his pack was strong, and the future stretched ahead filled with possibility rather than regret. The bleeding woman who had collapsed at his gates had given him more than children. She had given him redemption. Proof that love could survive even the darkest isolation, that family was worth any sacrifice, and that some choices transform not just individual lives, but the very nature of what was possible. Magnus Thornfield had spent 15 years learning to live with the weight of accidental death. Now, finally, he was learning to live with the joy of deliberate life, messy, complicated, infinitely precious life, shared with 7 small souls who had made him whole again. The Alpha King's choice had indeed shifted the pack forever, and he would never regret a single consequence.